Ah, nice. Good morning. Welcome to the last day of Build. It's been such an amazing week. Thanks for sharing it with us. Hopefully you've already learned a lot, but hopefully there's still something we can teach you today. This talk is Create Reusable Custom Metro-Style Controls. I am Jeff Fisher. This is my friend David Owens. And a little bit about who we are. We both test the web developer experience in Visual Studio Express. Specifically, we do that by building apps, just like you guys do. And I built the conference app that comes pre-installed on your devices, so the Build app. Thank you. Thank you. David wrote one of the sample apps for our gallery called Canvas Paint. And he also did a lot of work on the templates, so the new project templates for all the JavaScript apps. Yeah. One other thing I want to mention, if you've started coding already, and if you had any trouble at all taking those beginning templates and getting into making it a real app, David has a talk this afternoon where he actually shows you how to go from a template to a subset of his Canvas Paint sample, which I think is very informative. So you might want to check that out. So this talk is really about controls. And how many of you have already used some JS library to do controls in the past? Familiar with you? OK. And also, I guess, more in general, how many of you would say you're comfortable looking at JavaScript today? Familiar to you? It's not so bad? OK, great. And for those of you who didn't raise your hands, we're still going to talk about controls at a fairly high level, so I think you can follow along and appreciate the model without understanding all the nuances of like ECMAScript 5, for example. And our agenda is remarkably straightforward. We're going to tell you what is a control, what do we define a control to be in this new Metro-style app world. Then we're going to talk about authoring, both authoring with using controls and also authoring the controls themselves. And then we're going to talk about a little bit of how tool integration works, how you get nice IntelliSense with your controls. Then we're going to go over styling the controls because we want them to look and feel great, just like the rest of the platform. And you will leave here with the knowledge of how both to use controls that already exist in the platform today, or that other folks have written, and then how to create your own custom controls so you can share them with the world. So what is a control? Well, a control is really an abstract idea. It's a portion of UI that has some business logic associated with it. And for the control we're going to go over today, the UI is implemented in HTML and CSS, and the business logic is implemented in JavaScript. And it's really any reusable portion of your app. And we think that by structuring your app as a series of reusable controls, you gain a lot of benefits, not only while you're developing this app, but when you're developing your next app and your next app and your next app. Because it turns out you have to do the same thing a lot when you program. And the platform already has a number of intrinsic controls. And this slide might be familiar to you if you've gone to a talk that I'll reference at the end. But we have list boxes and buttons. We have some new ones with HTML5, progress bars and slider bars, toggle switches, that sort of thing. And you really have a pretty good starting point. And so when we talk about controls, usually we mean something a little more complicated than just these simple input elements, right? We're talking about some kind of date picker, or some kind of thing that interacts with a map, and just more robust controls. And how do we get there? How do we go beyond these intrinsics? Well, you can just go from scratch, right? You know HTML, you know CSS. You can cobble together smaller building blocks and then add some magic JavaScript logic in there and create something a little more interactive. But you can also create these out of existing controls. So you can compose controls together. Like you can tie a date picker to a text field, so when the user picks a date, it types it in for them in their flight itinerary. Or you can tie, like I said, something to a map. There's just lots of opportunities to tie pre-existing controls together and still create something really unique and powerful. And obviously, you can create them using any third-party library you want. So we're not prohibiting you from doing that. It's just JavaScript. So your favorite library of choice can help you build a control still. Or you can re-expose even an existing control from another toolkit that you already love as a control that we'll talk about in a moment. And so if we look at the conference app, there's this little filter bar thing across the top that you probably noticed. And it's basically a horizontal select element. You can see all the options, and you can pick one. One of them is clearly active, and the app responds to you picking one. In this case, we toggle between the different maps of the different floors. And we're going to look at how this control can be built, and then a little bit about how we would use it in the app itself. And so we're just going to go from pretty much scratch and go through the code for that. But before we get there, let's talk about authoring. So when we talk about authoring, we're talking about writing JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, which we've had quite a few talks already from the big picture sessions down to today. And if you haven't already been exposed to this, we have this library for JavaScript for helping you write Metro-style apps called the Windows Library for JavaScript, or WinJS, which is what I'm going to call it from now on. And what WinJS is really a number of things, but it's a good way for you to write your apps because it gives you so much when you start. It has all these styles that make your app look and feel out of the box like a Metro-style app, just some CSS files you include, which do a few things, right? They recolor things a bit for you to give it that Metro look, but they also will do things like make your buttons big enough so people's fingers can actually touch them, which is important for our platform. And then there's a number of other toolkits that we provide you that do a number of different things, such as helping you build a connected app, structuring your asynchronous code, organizing your code into modules. There's another talk which I'll reference at the end, which goes through the full breadth of what the Windows Library for JavaScript provides you. But what we're going to focus on is what part of the library helps us build controls. And if you have to be quizzed immediately after this talk, what is a control? What are we defining control to be? It's as simple as a function and two properties. So just three things that you need to know. And the constructor function is the way that you return this JavaScript object that represents the control, and that is tied to the DOM in the form of an HTML element. And that element can be provided to the control in the constructor function as the first argument. If it's omitted, then the control should create its own DOM element, which you can add later to the document. And then the second parameter is a optional object that contains extra parameters for the control itself. So it will help customize, in the case you'll see later, what filters appear in our filter bar and that sort of thing. And then once you have that object, the way that you tie it back to the DOM is on the DOM element you create or you receive from the user of the control, you just set this WinControl property on that. That points back to your JavaScript object. And then on the JavaScript object, you have an element property that points back to the DOM. So you have a nice two-way relationship. And given either side of this, if you just are querying the DOM, getting back the element that hosts the control, you can get to the JavaScript object and vice versa. And usually, you don't have to interact so much with the HTML element itself because you can style it all using CSS, of course. But you want to interact with the JavaScript object, which provides all the properties and methods you need to manipulate the business logic of that control. And so given that, this is the simplest control I can show you. It maintains the interface that we just talked about. It has a constructor function that takes in an element and some options. We don't actually have any options for this control, so we just go ahead and create a div, and then we set the div's inner text to hello world. And then we set up that two-way relationship that we just talked about. So this is not a very interesting control, but this is actually a control. I just want to impress upon you here that controls are not huge chunks of code. They're not a huge commitment to write. A control is really as simple as this. And so when you write your own controls, you don't need to invest in a lot of markup or extra framework magic in order to make them a control that our system understands. And to prove to you that consuming them is also not so bad, we're just going to switch over to David here, who's going to show you interacting with this filter bar control that we just talked about and what that looks like. David?
All right, thanks, Jeff. So, like we said, controls are really just constructor functions. And so what I have here for us is a blank project. Just created a new project with the VS project templates and got blank. And just to show you everything that's going on in this project, I've included the filter bar CSS and the filterbar.js files that we've already written. So now I would like to actually consume this control. So if we come over into our default.html, you can see that I've actually created a div down here. Controls are backed by divs. They're either backed by divs that are dynamically created for you during the execution of your program, or you can actually just reference divs that you already have in your HTML. And so I've just added a div here, filter bar, and then there's this output div that we'll be using a little bit later. So if I actually want to go ahead and instantiate a new filter bar, I can come over to our default.js. And we have this to-do. This is where you write your startup code. And so this is where I'm actually going to construct a new filter bar control. So the first thing I need to do is I need to get that backing div. So I can just type in var fb element equals document dot query selector, or I can do get element by e actually. Filter bar. So that's got me my backing div. So now what I actually want to do is I want to replace that kind of placeholder with actually the functionality of that filter bar control. That filter bar control. So I'm going to create another variable that's going to save off that instance of the filter bar. So I'll just type in filter bar, or var filter bar. And we're just going to go ahead and call that constructor function. So this is just the standard way you do this in JavaScript. And you can see here we have some IntelliSense help. So as Jeff mentioned earlier, we have these two parameters that we actually need. If I were to provide null in here for the element, we'd actually just dynamically create one for you in this control. But I have a specific div that I actually care about creating into a filter bar, so I'm going to pass that in here. So the next thing is we have that options record, and this is really just a way for you to provide options for your control. I happen to have a few properties already on this control, and one of those is the filters property. And that filters property is an array of objects, and those objects correspond to those filters that we saw in the conference app. So you saw floor 1, floor 2, floor 3. Those are the types of things that I'm going to pass into the filters, and so it's an array. So I'm going to go ahead and start to create my little options record. Just come in here, create a new object, and we're going to set it to filters. And like I said, it's an array. So let's go ahead and create an empty array. Now inside filters, you have a display text that may actually change, so we don't really want to key off of that. So we actually want to pass in two values for our filters, our individual filters. And so we have a text property and we have a value property. So I can just create another object here. We'll do text. Hello. Give it a value of 0. And we'll create another one. World with a value of 1. And we'll use these values a little bit later. But as you can see right here, this is actually all the code that we need to actually instantiate a new filter bar. So we hit F5. We can see this filter bar in action. So you can see we have our two little filters, hello and world. And out of the box, control actually needs some functionality to be useful. And so if we start tapping around on the different items, we can start to see some of that functionality take place. All right.
Switch over to slides. So great. So even using controls, not a lot of code, should be very familiar to you with other frameworks you've used for UI. And how bad was that code that we had to write to get that filter bar to work? Well, it's only about 80 lines of JavaScript, actually. 120 if we added in some IntelliSense comments there, which we'll go through in just a moment. But first, I just want to show you that, yes, it is the same pattern, right? We have a constructor function underneath that takes an element and some options David showed us. We go ahead, we create a div if there wasn't one passed in already, and then that little helper method there, set element, all that does is set up that two-way relationship that we talked about earlier. And then we have a little helper method, which is fairly useful when you're writing controls that take an optional argument or an optional object. And what this does, it just iterates through all the property names in that options object and then applies the value of those properties to that property on our JavaScript object itself. So it's just, if you had a filters property in that options argument, as David just showed you, it's the same as saying filter bar dot filters equals an object. So just a little bit of syntactic sugar for you. Here we define some properties that will be useful later. This specifically, this is just using ES5 semantics, by the way. So this is just defining some new properties on the object for us. And then we are creating them using this other helper method. And what this does, if you're familiar with how HTML events work, you have these on filter invoked, on filter changed properties on the object that let you set up an event handler without having to do add event listener. So we'll talk about events in just a moment, but that's what that's doing. And now we also saw that when we F5 the control, we saw things actually appear. And so all the code we did there was exactly what you might expect. We just talk to the DOM in the standard way from JavaScript. We clear out some inner HTML. This is another little tiny piece of ES5. We actually have for each now in JavaScript, which is quite nice. And inside of there, We can create elements in the usual way. Now, I imagine you wouldn't probably do it quite this way. You probably have some library that makes this a lot cleaner to write, but we just wanted to write this using first principles for you all today. And then once we have each filter created, or a DOM element for each filter created, we just go ahead and append that to our running page. And that's great, we have something, but this isn't really particularly useful until we start hooking up some behavior, such as selection and events to it. So David, you want to show them that?
Okay, yeah. So we talked about properties on the control, and another property that we have is a selected value. Maybe your application resumes from some PLM event that you got, and so you actually want to restore the selection that you had inside your filter bar. So the way you do that is, just the kind of the straightforward way that you think you could do it. So I can just type in filter bar here, and you can actually get some a little bit of IntelliSense to help us out. There's a selected value property right here. And so this is actually just using the ES5 semantics for actually doing the get sets. So we can apply additional functionality when we actually do a set. And so we'll see what that looks like when we actually F5 this application. So the next thing we want to do is, controls don't really mean anything unless you can actually interact with them. And so we have some of those events. And those events we showed you were filter invoked and filter changed. And they're subtly different. Filter invoked is used whenever you actually interact with any of your filters. So if you tap on hello, you'll get that event raised. If you tap on hello again, you'll still get that event raised. The filter changed event that we have on this control only gets raised when your filter's actually changed. So if you tap on hello, you'll get the filter invoked event. But if you tap on it again, the filter changed event, but you won't get the filter changed if you tap on it again unless you're actually changing selection. So how do we hook up to these events? Well, as Jeff mentioned, we have event properties. So we can do the slotted event style where you can do on, filter invoked, but you can also use the DOM level 3 add event listener pattern as well. So that's what I'm going to do. So to do this, we just come in here and we give it the name of the event to pass into add event listener. We pass in the functions that are going to handle. On invoked, which I've actually already implemented up here, and I'll show you guys the implementation soon. And I'm going to do the same thing for filter changed. So I'm going to do filter bar, add event listener, filter changed, on changed. All right. So this is exactly how you would add event listeners to any other DOM element. So we've kept that pattern, and we're just using the DOM level 3 spec there to define how those work. And so I'll show you the actual event handlers to see that there's actually no magic going on here. I'm making use of that other div that I talked about, that output div, and just going to print a message to let us know if anything's actually happening. So as long as I typed everything right, if we F5, first thing you should note is that world is now selected by default instead of hello. Maybe you're just maintaining state and you want to bring that back. So that's how you can do that. And if we start tapping around on the elements, you can see that, hey, we are starting to get some event notifications. So if I tap on hello again, you can see that we actually only get one of those. And so now Jeff's going to walk through how we can actually implement those inside of our own controls.
Great, thanks, David. So very familiar patterns, right? We're just setting properties and we're just adding event listeners, exactly like the DOM today. But how did we create those custom events in our control? Because under the hood, you realize that this is just HTML and CSS and JavaScript, so we are subscribing to the standard events for touch and click and any other DOM event you could want. We want to re-expose those as control-specific events that have semantic meaning for our control. And so the way that we do that, first off, to do the getter setter for selected value property, this is again a little bit of ES5 syntax we're using. And the Windows library for JavaScript makes this even easier. So as you define your own custom constructor functions to help you build objects, you can define properties on those objects using this sort of syntax. As you can see, we have a getter that returns the current selected value. So if we need to get that back out somehow from the control, we can do that. Then if you need to set a new value programmatically, as David was just showing, this is just doing some more little helper stuff. WinJS utilities query you can think of as a wrapper to document.querySelectorAll. If you're not familiar with that, it's a great new thing in the DOM which lets you select elements based upon a CSS scope there. So you can imagine if it's just the same thing as a CSS selector, but now you can get back either a specific DOM element or a list of DOM elements. So we have a little wrapper for that, and then we're just removing a class, so we unhighlight all the previous items that are no longer selected, and then we add a class back into the element that's now selected. We're making use of the dash value there so that you can figure out which element you previously had. You could obviously keep an internal map, but we're just doing it this way. And then we record the new value so that we can remember that when you call the getter again. And now I just want to say we could, right now, make you implement add event listener, remove event listener, and dispatch event yourself. We could define it in exactly the same way, define a property that has a function that implements the logic, have our own backing store for the events. But it turns out that having events in your controls is so incredibly common that we thought we'd just make it easy for you. And so we have an idea of mix-ins. And so for mix-ins, if you're not familiar with what that term is, it's just a set of fields and methods that are bundled together to provide some functionality to an object. So it's sort of like prototypical inheritance, but there is no inheritance chain here. We're just actually modifying and augmenting a live object with some extra abilities here. And so the two mix-ins that we provide for you in the Windows library for JavaScript, one of them is WinJS utilities.event mixin, and that will implement add event listener, remove event listener, and dispatch event for you and have its own queue to organize those, so you don't have to implement any of those methods yourself. The DOM event mixin does effectively the same thing as the previous one, except it also fires a custom event into the DOM itself using the DOM level 3 custom event API. So that way, if you want to treat this truly like a real DOM event, you can do that, and now you can catch that DOM event in an outer containing element or in the body, and it has all the full bubbling and capturing phases that you're used to with click and all those other standard DOM events. And really, when you would use one or the other, it depends on your specific app. I think if your object model, your control object model, closely maps to your DOM model, you'd want to just go ahead and use the DOM event mixin. It's very natural feeling. If you have a very, very complex DOM, where you have a much simpler object model, so like you're building some like really fancy calendar view and you have all these divs to make sure everything's organized, and it still logically has a nice backing object reference, like it goes from like, oh, you have days and those are inside of weeks and those are inside of months. You may want to stick to just the pure JavaScript model just because it's a little bit cleaner than having to go through the DOM, and it might be a little bit faster too for extremely complex DOMs. And how do we get that actually into our control? Well, it's incredibly straightforward. We have this WinJS class.mix, which allows us to add the mix-in dynamically to our constructor function. And now every object that constructor function creates will have these mix-in members automatically. And then how do we actually dispatch the event? Well, like I say, we added a member called dispatch event, and we just go ahead and call that with the custom event name, and then the details object, which can be any object that you want, that lets you do things like, for example, in David's control, showed us which value was selected or invoked. So very flexible and fairly straightforward. But tool integration is really where we saw all that IntelliSense come up. So how did we get that? So we have this nice control. How do we also make sure that we can use it again in a month or 2 months or 3 months when we've forgotten what we just implemented? And really, it's as simple as writing some doc comments in your code, and that's how we were driving all those IntelliSense bubbles that David was showing. And we can do things like describe the method, describe its arguments, provide little bits of help. And that just is really nice, right? Not only for your own recollection, but then if you want to share this control, people don't have to dig through your JavaScript and try to figure out, oh, you know, what are these arguments? Some are optional. Sometimes they are not optional. How to use the control. It's just right there in the authoring environment for you. All right. So the last thing we're going to talk about is styling. So we've kind of seen how you can build a control, and you can imagine lots and lots of complex control logic using the patterns that we just identified. But how do we make a control look and feel like a Metro-style control? Well, when we talk about Metro-style apps, we have two themes primarily. We have this UI light.css and this UI dark CSS. And the UI light is a light background with dark text, and the UI dark is basically a dark background with light text, right? And The thing for you to be aware is if your control has some colors in it that perhaps don't look good on one of these two themes, when people are building their real apps, they're probably going to be using one of them, and if your control uses a lot of, say, yellow, and you're on UI Light down there, it's not going to show up very well. And so just, as you're building your control, realize that we have this split world, and if necessary, create just two simple CSS files for your control. Just like how we have two CSS files for the platform, you can create a filter bar light and a filter bar dark, for example. Our control is very straightforward. We inherit the text color, the default text color anyway, from the UI Light and UI Dark, so we don't have to do anything for filter bar, but just be aware of that in your own controls. And then also be aware that there is some accessibility concerns here. So we have a number of high contrast modes in Windows, and these high contrast modes, besides being fairly similar to UI Light and UI Dark, since usually they emphasize dark text or light text, they do some subtle extra things to you, such as they will disable background images on your element. So if you have this nicely styled control that has background images, and then a user has high contrast mode turned on, they won't be able to see the glyphs that describe what the button does, for example. And there's a whole talk that I believe happened yesterday, so you should catch the video if you didn't go to that talk, that talks about building accessible Metro-style apps, but it's just as applicable to Metro-style controls as well. So just be aware of that. There's some CSS magic you can do to get around having the images disabled on you, for example. But besides that, just in general, we want controls to be accessible. We want them to be great on any input device. So if someone's using touch, it should just work. And actually, if they're using UI Light and UI Dark, that should be mostly done for you. But just be aware of that. You don't want to shrink your buttons too small and that sort of thing. And it should be just accessible using mouse. And then for keyboard, there's, again, just some ARIA properties you can set that we go over in that accessibility talk. And really, it's not a lot of work to make your app super accessible and make your controls accessible. And I think you'll find that the community that uses assistive software is very flattering to apps that make that extra effort to become accessible. And you can get really good reviews and really good word of mouth in the App Store if you take that little bit of extra effort. So the last thing we're going to talk about is using Expression Blend, our wonderful tool for doing styling changes to our apps. And now we're going to use that on this control we just showed you in order to style it and customize it a bit. David?
Yes, if you guys have not tried out Expression Blend yet, you guys should definitely do it. It's a great tool, and we're going to just take a brief look at it today to see how we can actually style the selected color of our control. You know, maybe we don't like the blue, maybe we want to be hip and get closer to that green that you guys have been seeing everywhere for the build conference. So, you know, I could actually just go into my CSS file and go update those values. We actually do have a little bit of like a color picker there for you, but if we want to see what this application is going to look like at runtime with our changes, Blend is really the best tool for us to do that. So I'm going to come over to the Solution Explorer, and if we right-click on our project, there's a nice little menu item here that can open up our project in Expression Blend. So the thing I want to impress to you, this is a little dialogue that's going to just click yes to. The best thing about Blend is it's actually running your code. So if you guys haven't gone to any of the Blend talks yet, I highly recommend you watch them. Jeff did one yesterday with Eric Saltwell that talked about how you can actually debug your apps, and you'll get a lot more details there. But I'll just touch on touch the high level of a few of the main points from that talk. So you can see over here we have our application, and if we start moving our mouse around on the design surface, you'll see these blue squares start coming up. These are the adorners. These are letting you know what elements are underneath your mouse at any given position in your application. So if we go ahead and select World, and if you look down here on the left, you can see we have this live DOM. And this is a representation of the DOM as the application is actually running. And I want to call out one little detail over here. You'll see these lightning bolts. And these lightning bolts are very handy for you to diagnose what's going on in your application. The lightning bolts mean that these elements were actually created by code. There's no backing markup in an HTML file that is actually, like, you can go find these spans. These are the spans that we actually created for the filter bar. And then the other thing I want to show you over here on the right is the CSS properties window. And this tells you all of the rules that are actually being applied to your selected element at any given time. And so like I mentioned, I actually want to go ahead and update the color of the world property, or sorry, of the world filter, because that's the selected. And so in here, I have this long selector rule, filter bar, filter.selected. And so CSS has a lot of properties. And I could come through here, I could search if I knew the colors, but I really just want to see what properties are actually set on the element that I have selected. So there's this checkbox that I can actually click. And that'll get rid of all the other properties that are actually set on the element at any given time. So I can click on the color, and I can just kind of start dragging around. Said we wanted something a little more green, and that looks okay. Now we can do this in other tools today. We can go ahead and update the live running application. But the best thing about Blend here is that this has actually gone ahead and updated my CSS. So I don't have to go take that value that I just created, or that I just saved, or I've just figured out, and go save that back in my CSS, find out where that rule is. Blend's already done that for me. And you can see up here, we actually have a little dirty buffer, and you can see that the filter has actually been changed right here. The other feature I want to just highlight in Blend is called interactive mode. If we take a look at a more complicated app like the Build app, the conference app, you'll notice that the filter bar is not really on that default page that you go to. So how would you actually get there in your application to go style those things? And so Blend has this mode called interactive mode. So if you click on interactive mode, this moves you out of design mode, which design mode is where you're dragging around your mouse, and you can interact with the elements and select them and adorn them. Interactive mode is all about actually using your application to get you to a different state. And so if I actually start clicking on these elements, you'll notice that the events are actually getting fired, and we're getting, the application is actually running. And so we can get into a different state here, and then we can just pull right back out of interactive mode, and then we can start styling our application in that context. And so that's my favorite feature of Blend. So hope you guys all check out Blend. It's a very powerful tool and should help you a lot in your development of Metro-style apps. Jeff?
Yeah, thanks, David. So yeah, Blend has a number of other features we didn't show here just now. It can actually change the design surface to simulate the snap view and the fill view, and you can really make sure that your whole app looks great on all devices in different resolutions and different modes. So really recommend you check it out if you haven't already, and there's some great talks if you have missed those. So what do the styles actually look like on this control that we built you? I'll walk you through them quickly. We had a containing element that contained each of the filters, and that just had some overflow stuff, so it scrolled nicely with touch. We didn't have to do a whole lot here. Then we had some styling on the actual filter elements themselves. We just changed the text size a little bit, so it was a little bit bigger, more emphasized. Then we had the selected color that David showed you is really easy to modify with Blend. So we really recommend that when you are styling your control, that you think about what users of that control will want to change, so that you make sure that you add all the right classes and all the right properties that you need to, so that they can just go ahead and restyle your control, make it look like a natural part of their app. And it should be really easy to do as long as you just avoid inline styles and make sure you add about a class to every visible piece of the control. So to summarize what we just talked about, the point of controls is that you can write them without a lot of code. They're actually very straightforward the way we've defined them. These aren't super complex things that you have to memorize and follow some pattern or start some new project for. They're just a convention of structuring your code. And one nice thing about this is that if you do this, if you remember the syntax from day one, when they had that data-win-control, all that stuff, you can actually use that markup in your HTML to instantiate your control declaratively as well as imperatively like we showed you here today, and that just comes for free. So the Win.js system knows how to instantiate your control as long as you're following this element options pattern in your constructor function. Then we talked about styling the controls, and really you just got to consider the UX guidelines here, make them accessible, make them great, make them beautiful, and then Expression Blend is right there to help you do that. And then once you have a control and you want to go put it online, share it with your friends, share it with your teammates, just go ahead, annotate that with some dot comments, and now they have nice, rich, beautiful IntelliSense that helps them use that control. And with that, you technically now know everything you need to go build a control. So but before you rush out and build your own controls, we do want to go over some related sessions that you might have missed so far at Bill. I know we have a lot of great sessions here. The first one is creating Metro-style apps quickly with built-in controls. That will go over all of the new intrinsics in the platform that we've added, all the HTML5 goodness that's also available mostly in the browser as well. Then the introducing the Windows library for JavaScript. That goes into all of the detail you need to use WinJS to its most effectiveness, and including not just the pieces we talked here today, but other toolkits and helper methods for structuring your app. Then we have reaching more customers with accessible Metro-style apps in HTML. Again, highly recommend this, because honestly, if you try to read the ARIA spec online, and you just want to say, oh, I want to make my app accessible, how do I do that? The spec is huge. I wouldn't recommend trying to navigate it without a guide, and that talk will get you up and going and knowing what important properties you need to set in your apps and in your controls so that you can have a nice, accessible experience for everyone. Then the last thing that we want to also recommend is debugging your Metro-style apps using HTML. That's my talk yesterday that David mentioned. And this, we actually go fairly deep into Blend and Visual Studio to teach you how to debug layout issues you'll run into, as well as script issues that you'll run into when building your apps. And with that, we have some further reading documentation. You can try to click on the giant screen, but I don't think that will work very well. When you get my slides later, they'll be available through the app on your device. You can download the whole PowerPoint, click on these, but most of it's on dev.windows.com, easy to find. Then we really want to do here, since ostensibly you're all here to write controls, we want to make sure we gave you enough time with 2 experts stuck in a room to ask them as many questions as you want. So we have 3 microphones available if you just want to head up, ask us anything at all about the filter bar, ask us to show something again. Yes, sir?
I have a question about, you talked about mixing in custom event dispatching into your controls. Is there a way to annotate what events your controls support so users of the controls can easily see those?
So yes, in the doc comments, you can actually specify multiple method signatures. Get out of the way here so you guys can see. Multiple method signatures, since JavaScript doesn't really allow you to do overloads, but it does allow you to just do whatever you want with your functions. So you can specify multiple signatures that way. You can specify optional arguments. You can specify what events are actually raised up by your control. And so there's a nice way to actually document all that.
And
I think that information is on the dev.windows.com.
It should be,
If not, crack open the WinJS code and take a look at like the UI collection and then the list view. And then there's examples right there on how we actually do that with our own stuff.
And one thing that I've found very helpful is not only can you look at the nice doc comments, but just the fact that we added those on filter change, on filter invoke. Those are a good hint, even in the Windows runtime, as they project events that way. So if you're wondering, oh, what can I put with add event listener, there's the list. Just remove the word on, and you have the actual event name. Sir?
Yeah, do you guys have any guidelines or suggestions on how you would want to do animations within controls or baking in that kind of functionality?
Yes. You want to?
Yeah, yesterday there was actually a talk on how you actually add animations and make your applications, as Jensen said, not look like crap. So I don't remember the talk number. I went to it yesterday. But it was a good talk. Dale Robinson, I think, was one of the guys on there. So if you search for that, it's a great talk on actually how to apply those animations. We provide an animations.js file, which gives a lot of the Metro style animations out of the box. So you don't have to worry about like, oh, what does the depressed look actually look like? We provide all that code and the CSS that actually backs those animations for you.
Yeah, so we'll do the CSS3 transitions for you. You just have to use like transition content. It will swipe in, crossfade for you. It's pretty nice.
It's pretty easy. You just pass in the element and it handles that animation.
And if there's another JavaScript-based animation library already out there that you like, of course, you can use that one as well.
Yes, my question had to do with the HTML formatting. Was there any limitations on what you could use there, or is it very limited? On HTML, like I could put a frame in there and get a little bit of, and then I have a window and I'm kind of expanding my control knowledge. Did I miss the point? Do you understand my question?
I didn't know. Did you
So
understand?
basically you had HTML, you had bodies and everything. From there, I started adding frames, inline code, inline.
Like, can you do inline code, like inline script, like event handlers and whatnot?
And more like, you have the HTML side. You
Uh-huh.
have the default JS.
Yep.
Right, in that left side on HTML, then I could start adding frames and different components. Is there a list of what you can and cannot do?
Like in your apps, what HTML elements can take, like can you frame content from web sources and do all
The
that?
actual frame, as in a...
Like an iframe?
Yeah, like an
Oh,
iframe.
okay.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I should have put the I in front of it.
Yes, you can use iframes inside there.
So now I can actually host something. You see where I'm going with it? And now I have a control. I built a control. I have an iframe. I can now bring up...
Yeah, so like for example, say that you wanted to use Bing Maps in your app. So that is an example of a control that you have to iframe because you have to include external script in that. And if you haven't seen this before in one of the talks, there's actually 2 compartments that your apps run in. By default, you're inside what's called like the local compartment. And that gives you access to a number of wonderful things like the Windows runtime, but it also has a couple restrictions on it, like you can't include external script. You'll get a weird error if you try to do that. And the way that you get around this is you create an iframe, just as you were mentioning, and then you can now inside of an iframe, if it's pointed to either a web address, so a real web address, you could iframe your actual website in there if you wanted, or some server you control. Or if you look at the scheme of the URL, what is it again, the MS AppX or something, the MS AppX web? So if you go to window.location.href, you'll notice that there's a custom scheme, not HTTP. And that if you just take the one that's by default on in your project, we can actually take a look at that if you wanted. Then you append web to it. You can host a page that's in your package but behaves now like it's in the web compartment, and then can include, for example, the Bing Map API. And now that you have these 2 frames, the way that you talk between them is you use the standard messaging API. So there's a post message on iframes, and you can just create a nice simple protocol that lets you pass back, like, oh, from your internal app, you get the user's location, now you pass it into your iframe, and you map that in Bing.
Does it have the same limitations of no plugins? When I have an iframe, I'm now hosting my own web page. I'm getting detailed. But you follow where I'm going. Instead of having, it's a Chrome list, of course, we're inside the...
Yeah, just like Metro style IE doesn't support plugins.
So that page brought up would have to be clean HTML5 or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, it has to be whatever is supported in the Metro style IE.
Yeah, Metro, that's what I was trying to
Yeah.
Okay.
So if it works in Metro style IE, you should be able to iframe it, and it should work the same way there.
That was my specific question. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you guys have any guidelines for how to develop controls and apps in general that would run both in the Metro environment and in the browser? Like, if you're going to use Windows runtime in there in the JavaScript application or control, how do I make sure it runs in the browser and in the app environment?
Yeah. Do you want to handle this one, Dave?
Sure. As long as you're not actually calling into the Windows runtime, you shouldn't run into too many issues. Like, we're just using standard HTML5 and CSS3 and the ECMAScript 5
What if I want to
spec.
fork it? Let's say I want
So if you're
some
gonna-
functionality
sorry.
in the app and the rest in the browser.
The easiest way is just you have to abstract out that data that you're actually not doing. So you could take a web application that's on the web today, and you could port that into a
Right,
Metro style app,
Or
and
take
then
it the other way around, like
yeah, but the pieces that you would say, oh, I want to light up a search contract, for example, and so that'd be a portion of your application that you would just have to factor out that wouldn't be available on the web. There's lots of different ways you can do that. You can just do
Is there any
namespace hiding.
techniques on how to check if I'm in the app or am I on the web? Like how to differentiate there?
Well, an easy way to do feature detection in this case would be you could check for the Windows object. So like if window.windows exists, then well, unless you created that variable, you're actually in the local compartment.
Yeah, all the WinRT is under the Windows namespace.
So that's the easiest way, and that namespace is immutable. So you could potentially fake it if you were in the web, but you can't modify it if you're in the actual local compartment. So I would just do feature detection like that. Like if window.windows, then light up my app, Metro style. We usually recommend using feature detection whenever possible for new features, even in CSS3 and that sort of thing.
Any other questions?
Any other questions? Anything at all?
Okay.
How about support for blend? And like, can you style a list view and change properties and things? So can custom controls expose that to blend so that it shows up in the property grid, or does that make sense?
So you want the actual list items that are being rendered?
Well, I mean, I haven't looked at it, but does the list view have a way to configure it in blend and set grid rows or flip properties?
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. You want to like customize the number of rows that are inside your grid?
Right. I'm wondering with custom controls, can you expose anything to blend to let you configure the control inside blend?
Gotcha. So Blend hasn't released anything for
Oh, wait.
this that allows you to do this with custom controls. Some of the built-in WinJS controls give you some actual properties that you can use, but unfortunately with the developer preview for Blend here, there's not a supported way to actually do that with your own controls right now.
But you're right. So for list view, for example, we just drug this in from the asset panel, and now we can specify there's some custom properties that object exposes, like the item renderer, the group renderer, and the group data source. And so I think it's excellent feedback that you would like to do this in Blend for your own controls, and we will certainly make sure they are aware of that. But yeah, so you can see we have that for our built-in controls, and you can imagine that it would be lovely if we could do that with custom controls as well. So
yeah, it'd be nice if we could do selected value, for example, on our filter bar, but unfortunately we couldn't do that.
So yeah, I mean, so for that, would you expect it would be some custom markup? I imagine that you do similar to the doc comments.
Are these just baked in, hard-coded into this editor, these fields that are allowed to style, or is it coming from WinJS implementation of it?
It is, well, I mean, getting into implementation details, but it is specified through WinJS. So I mean, there might be some.
There's no supported way to do
Yeah,
that.
there's no supported way right now.
You may go into the trenches if you wish, but
Yeah, feel free to explore, but we have no committed feature support for that yet.
You alluded to ECMAScript 5 a couple times. Is that supported natively in the IE browser, or is that something that's implemented through the WinJS library specifically?
Oh, it's in an IE.
Okay.
So you can take advantage of it in IE 10.
Yeah, IE 10.
IE 9 has most of it, actually. We added a couple things in IE 10, such as strict mode. But yeah, most of this, like object.create, object.define property, object.get on property names, that's all there available today. So, any other questions? All right, if we have no other questions, then we will be available to you in the expo hall if you come up with some after this, or you can just feel free to come up here afterwards if you're a little bit shy about going into the mic, talking to the mic. But thank you, you've been a lovely audience.
Thanks.